Welcome to Vixen Story. If you are a fan of creepy, mysterious stories, and the dark spiritual world, then you have come to the right place. My channel will take you on adventures to haunted places, explore horror legends, and experience your deepest fears together. Prepare yourself, turn off the lights, and listen to some truly terrifying ghost stories. In the summer of 2008, the Carter family moved into a quaint, dilapidated mansion nestled in the remote Outer Banks of North Carolina. Michael Carter, a writer looking for some peace and quiet to finish his new thriller, was drawn to the house's dark exterior and rich history. His wife, Susan, a painter, was a little uneasy about the place's desolate, cold exterior. Their only daughter, 12-year-old Emily, was fascinated by the new house, thinking of it as a mysterious castle in a fairy tale. The moving truck stopped in front of the rusty iron gate, which swung open like a greeting from the past. The three-story Victorian mansion loomed before them, with peeling paint, dark windows like deep eye sockets, and a gray tiled roof covered in moss. The house was surrounded by dense trees, creating a gloomy and isolated atmosphere. Michael tried to be optimistic, hugging Susan. "You see, Susan, this is the place I need. Absolute peace and endless inspiration." Susan just smiled slightly, her eyes still a little doubtful as she looked up at the dark windows. Emily quickly ran inside, her footsteps echoing in the large, cold hallway. The inside of the house was even more shabby than it looked. Dust covered the old furniture, cobwebs hung in the corners, and a musty smell filled the air. Sunlight barely filtered through the thick, dirty curtains. Emily squealed with delight, running from room to room, exploring the large, empty rooms. "Wow, Mom and Dad, my room even has a window overlooking the ocean." Michael and Susan followed, trying to imagine what it would be like to live here. As they were cleaning the living room, an older woman, probably a neighbor, appeared at the door. Her name was Martha, and she lived in a small house not far away. Her face was wrinkled, her eyes sunken as she looked at Michael and Susan with concern. "Hello, you too," she said, her voice hoarse. "I heard someone new moved into this old house. Don't you know anything about it?" Michael politely invited Martha in. "We just moved in today. Do you know anything about the history of this house?" Martha sat down in the old armchair and sighed. "Oh, it's a long history. This house has been empty for many years. There used to be a family living here, the Blackwoods. One night, they were all brutally murdered. No one knows why, and the murderer was never caught." Susan shivered, hugging Michael's arm tightly. Emily stood silently listening, her eyes wide with curiosity and a little fear. "They say the Blackwoods spirits still haunt this house," Martha continued, her voice trailing off as if she were telling a secret. "Many have seen strange shadows, heard strange noises, and felt an unnatural coldness in the house. Some have even said that a shadow killer still roams around here, looking for new victims." Michael tried to act unconvinced, but Martha's story had planted a bit of unease in his heart. After Martha left, Susan looked at Michael with concern. "Do you think what she told you is true?" Michael hugged his wife, trying to reassure her. "Don't worry, honey. It's probably just the same old ghost story. We'll be fine." But as the night fell, and the house was plunged into darkness, both Michael and Susan felt a strange unease wash over them. The soft scrabble of the wooden floorboards, the wind whistling through the broken windows seemed to carry whispers of the past. Emily was fast asleep in her room on the third floor. Michael and Susan lay in bed, unable to sleep. Suddenly, They both heard a very faint sound coming from the hallway outside. Like light footsteps. They both listened in silence. The footsteps stopped right in front of their bedroom door. An unusual chill spread through the room, and they felt as if someone was standing there, just outside the door, watching them in the darkness. Michael and Susan stood in silence, listening to the footsteps that had stopped right outside their bedroom door. They both felt a chill run down their spines. "Do you think it's just the wind, Michael?" Susan whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Michael shook his head. "I don't think so." The footsteps were very clear, like someone was walking in the hallway. He slowly reached for the doorknob, but then pulled his hand back. "Maybe we should wait and see," he said, trying to reassure them both. But their eyes were filled with worry. After a few tense minutes of silence, Michael decided to check. He gently opened the bedroom door, peeking out into the dark hallway. No one was there. Pale moonlight streamed through the window at the end of the hallway, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. Michael stepped outside, walking down the hallway, listening for any sounds. Suddenly, he felt the temperature in the hallway drop significantly. A chill wash over him. Even though it was a summer night, he felt as if someone was watching him from the shadows. Even though he couldn't see anyone, the shadows on the walls seemed to be moving slightly, as if they had their own lives. On the third floor, in her large room, Emily was sleeping soundly. Suddenly, she woke up with a start. A terrible nightmare had just come upon her. She dreamed of strange shadows lurking in the corners of the room. They slowly approached her bed, and a cold, bony hand touched her cheek. Emily screamed, jumped out of bed, her heart pounding. She quickly turned on the night light, looked around the room, but saw nothing. There were only familiar furniture and quiet shadows. She tried to calm herself, but the feeling of coldness and fear still haunted her. She wanted to call her parents, but was afraid of disturbing them. The next morning, Susan decided to clean up the dusty attic. While rummaging through old chests, she accidentally found an old diary. The leather cover was worn, hidden under a loose floorboard. The diary looked very old. The pages inside were yellowed. Susan curiously opened it to read. The neatly handwritten lines told about the Blackwood family's life in this mansion. At first they were normal diary entries, but as time went on, the lines became more and more scribbled and full of fear. Strange things began to happen in the house. Unexplained noises, passing shadows, and a vague fear about a ghostly presence. Michael tried to concentrate on writing in his study, but he was constantly disturbed by strange noises. He heard very soft whispers coming from the wall, as if someone was talking secretly. He also often saw shadows flashing in the corner of his eyes. Even though he was sure he was alone in the room, the feeling that someone was watching him constantly haunted him, making him feel extremely uneasy and uncomfortable. He tried to push those thoughts away, telling himself that it was just his imagination. But the strange phenomena continued. At dinner, the family tried to talk and eat normally, but the atmosphere in the house was still heavy and tense. Emily occasionally glanced at the shadows in the corners of the dining room. Susan kept thinking about the scary diary entries she had read, and Michael kept hearing strange whispers. The conversation was awkward and uncomfortable. "What do you think of this house, Emily?" Michael tried to start a conversation. "I like it, Dad," Emily replied, but her voice sounded a little off. Susan was silent, her eyes filled with sadness. That evening, while Michael was reading in the living room, the old piano in the corner of the room suddenly played notes by itself. A slow, sad melody echoed in the quiet space. Michael was startled, dropping the book on the floor. He stared at the piano, unable to believe what he had just heard. The melody lasted only a few notes before abruptly stopping, but it was enough to make Michael's hair stand on end. He knew it wasn't just his imagination anymore. Meanwhile, Susan was reading the last pages of the diary. She was shocked to read a line scrawled, almost illegible, but enough for her to understand its meaning. He has come. The dark killer. He walks the house at night. One by one, no one escapes. The diary page ended abruptly there. With shaky handwriting, Susan was terrified. She believed that her family was in real danger. She rushed downstairs, looking for Michael and Emily to warn them. Susan rushed down the stairs, her face pale and filled with panic. She almost stumbled as she entered the living room, where Michael was reading and Emily was drawing. "Michael, you have to listen to me," she gasped, her voice shaking. "The diary. The Blackwood family diary. There's a shadowy killer. He killed them." Michael frowned, putting the book down. "What are you talking about? Susan? Calm down." Emily stopped drawing, her big round eyes looking at her mother worriedly. Susan recounted intermittently what she had read in the diary, her voice choking when she mentioned the last lines. He's still here. Michael, I feel someone's presence in this house. We have to leave now." Michael tried to stay calm, hugging Susan. "Listen, it's probably just old stories. I'm too worried." But Susan's extremely frightened expression made him feel uneasy. Emily hugged the teddy bear tightly, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm scared too. Daddy, I've seen dark shadows in my room." Just then, a loud bang sounded from downstairs, startling all three of them. The crystal chandelier on the living room ceiling rattled. Susan screamed, hugging Emily tightly. "See, I told you, there's something here." Michael also stood up, his expression becoming serious. "I'll go down and see what's going on." Susan grabbed his hand tightly. "No, don't go, Michael. It's dangerous." But Michael had made up his mind. "You have to check. Emily and I are here. Lock the door." Michael cautiously walked down the stairs, each step very light. The darkness downstairs was thick and cold. He listened, but didn't hear any other sounds. He went into the kitchen, where the noise had just come from, but everything seemed normal. The window was still tightly closed. There was no sign of a break-in. He felt a cold chill run down his spine, and a strange sense of unease enveloped him. He felt as if someone was watching him from the shadows. While Michael was downstairs, Susan and Emily sat silently in the living room, hugging each other in fear. Suddenly, they heard a very soft whisper coming from the hallway, as if someone was calling their names. "Susan, Emily." The whisper was cold, making both women feel their hair stand on end. Emily seemed scared, burying her face in her mother's chest. Susan hugged her daughter tightly, trying to calm her down, but she was also trembling. Michael returned to the living room, his expression still troubled. "I didn't find anything," he said. "Maybe some animal just hit the window." But Susan didn't believe him. "No, Michael, Emily and I just heard someone calling our names." Michael frowned, starting to worry too. These strange events were getting beyond reasonable explanation. "We can't stay here another night," Susan said, her voice firm. "We have to leave now." Michael nodded, agreeing with his wife. "Okay, we'll pack up a few things and leave immediately." They decided to spend the night at a nearby motel and call the police in the morning. They went up to the bedroom, locked the door, and put furniture across it just in case. All three of them lay in bed, trying to sleep, but no one could. They were all listening for the slightest noise in the house. Late at night, when everything seemed to have fallen asleep, the Carter family was suddenly awakened by a cold and terrifying sound. A soft but persistent scratching sound sounded right outside their bedroom door. The scratching stopped for a moment, then continued, steady and repetitive. Then, a hoarse whisper sounded, very close, right on the other side of the door. "You can't escape." The cold whisper coming from outside the bedroom door made the Carter family freeze in utter terror. "You can't escape." The voice was hoarse, carrying a confident tone, as if the speaker had their fate in his hands. Michael hugged Susan and Emily tightly, his eyes frantically looking around the room, desperately searching for a way out. "We're trapped," Susan whispered, tears streaming down her face. Emily was restless, burying her face in her mother's lap. "No, we can't just sit here and wait," Michael said, his voice shaking but determined. "There has to be a way. There has to be a way out." He hurried to the window. Trying to open it, the old wooden window creaked uneasily, and opened only a small crack. Outside was pitch black, with nothing to be seen but the shadows of tall trees swaying in the night wind. "Too high," Michael muttered, looking down at the dark ground below. "It would be dangerous to jump." The soft scratching at the door continued, steady and haunting. Susan remembered the diary. She quickly flipped through the yellowed pages, trying to find any information that might help them deal with the shadow killer. The old man's neat handwriting appeared before her eyes, telling of terrifying nights, of lurking shadows, and of extreme fear. Maybe there's something in here," Susan whispered, her eyes reading each line intently. Emily, in a panic, suddenly grabbed her mother's hand. "Mommy, I see something under the door." She pointed to the small crack under the bedroom door. Michael and Susan hurriedly looked. In the dim light of the night light, they saw a thin, shapeless shadow creeping gently through the crack. It moved slowly, without making a sound, but it brought a colder and more terrifying feeling than anything they had ever experienced. Michael tried to pry open the window, using all his strength to open it wide. Finally, the door opened wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but below was still a dark and dangerous space. The scratching at the door outside grew louder, accompanied by soft banging sounds, as if someone outside was testing the door's strength. "We have no choice," Michael said, his voice full of concern. "We have to climb out." Susan suddenly stopped at a page of the diary. She read aloud a passage, her voice trembling. "The Shadow Slayer. It's not an ordinary spirit. It's made of fear and darkness. It can move through shadows, and it gets stronger when people are afraid." Susan looked at Michael and Emily with horror. So the more afraid we are, the stronger it gets." At that moment, the bedroom door began to shake violently. There were loud bangs, accompanied by the sound of creaking wood. The wardrobe they had placed against the door began to move. "He's trying to break the door," Michael shouted, pushing Susan and Emily away from the door. He quickly grabbed the heavy brass table lamp placed on the cabinet, preparing for an unequal battle. The sound of splintering wood rang out, and a large crack appeared in the door near the lock. Before Michael could react, there was a terrifying bang, and the bedroom door was thrown open, crashing into the wall. A tall, shapeless black figure stood in the doorway. Its red eyes flashed in the darkness, staring at the Carter family with a murderous hunger. But that was not the most terrifying thing. From the ceiling, right above them, the wooden plank leading to the attic was also torn apart. And another, Thinner and more terrifying black figures slowly descended. The Carter family was completely surrounded. Two black figures surrounded the Carter family in the cramped bedroom. The black figure at the door was tall and thin, its red eyes glowing in the darkness like two burning coals. The black figure hovered from the ceiling, thin and trembling, seemingly emitting a bone-chilling cold. Michael, Susan, and Emily were all frozen in horror. Unable to speak, the air in the room became thick, heavy, and filled with an unpleasant stench. The shadow at the door slowly entered the room, its footsteps making no sound, but each movement exuded a deadly threat. It extended its bony, black hand, its long, sharp fingers like claws trembling in the air. Michael clenched the table lamp in his hand, ready to fight to the end to protect his wife and child. "Susan, hold Emily tight," he whispered, his voice hoarse with fear but still full of determination. The shadow from the ceiling also began to move. It slowly descended, hovering right above them. The faint moonlight shining through the window shone in, allowing them to see its shape more clearly. It was the image of a woman, her long hair hanging down, covering her face, her thin body wearing an old white dress, seemingly sobbing in pain. Suddenly, the shadow at the door roared, rushing towards Michael. Michael swung the table lamp, hitting it. A loud bang sounded. The lamp shattered into many pieces, but the shadow seemed to be unharmed. It continued to rush forward, grabbing Michael's wrist with its icy cold hand. Michael screamed in pain, trying to struggle but couldn't escape. While Michael was struggling with the shadow at the door, Susan realized that the shadow on the ceiling was staring at Emily. The eyes of that female ghost were filled with tears, and a faint whisper sounded, "My daughter. My daughter." Susan was horrified to realize that this was probably the spirit of the mother in the Blackwood family, who lost her child in the massacre years ago. Susan hugged Emily tightly, trying to shield her daughter. "What should we do, Michael?" she sobbed. Michael, even though he was being held tightly by the shadow, still tried to speak. His voice choked. "Please, remember what Martha said. The shadow killer grows strong with fear. We must not be afraid." But the fear had overwhelmed them, too great to control. The shadow at the door tightened its grip on Michael's hand, and he felt his strength slowly draining away. The ghost of a woman from the ceiling began to move towards Emily, its fragile hand reaching out to her. In a moment of despair, Emily remembered the old teddy bear she always carried with her. She hugged it tightly and whispered, "This is not your home, go away." A strange thing happened. As Emily hugged the teddy bear tightly and said those words, the ghost of a woman on the ceiling suddenly stopped. It looked at Emily and the teddy bear in her hand, then slowly disappeared into the air, leaving a cold breath. The shadow at the door seemed to be affected as well. It loosened its grip on Michael's wrist and took a step back. Michael quickly pushed it away and rushed to hug Susan and Emily. The three hugged each other, trembling, terrified but also full of hope. Perhaps love and innocence helped them fight the darkness. But they knew that, even though the ghost had disappeared, the presence of the dark killer still lingered in this house, and they would never forget this terrible night. They decided to leave this mansion immediately, never to return. True Ghost Story 2. 14 Sycamore Street. In the fall of 1998, the Miller family moved to 14 Sycamore Street, a quiet residential neighborhood in the suburbs of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. David Miller, a software engineer who had just taken a new job at a large technology company in the city, decided to rent the house to shorten his daily commute. His wife, Sarah, an elementary school teacher, was initially hesitant to move to a strange place. But she was quickly convinced by the cozy appearance and reasonable rent of this two-story house. Their 10-year-old son, Alex, was very excited about having a new room and a spacious garden to play in. Moving day took place in the typical cool autumn weather. The yellow leaves rustled on the deserted street. Number 14 looked quite ordinary compared to the surrounding houses. With a slightly worn-off white paint job, a low wooden fence surrounding a small front garden, and a spacious porch. Inside, everything seemed clean and tidy. Although the furniture was a bit worn, the owner, an elderly lady named Mrs. Henderson, had tidied everything up before they arrived. "Welcome to our home," Mrs. Henderson said warmly, but her eyes seemed a little sad as she looked at the house. "I hope you enjoy it." David thanked her politely and took the keys. After Mrs. Henderson left, the Millers began unloading their belongings from the car. On the first evening in the new house, after the basic arrangements were made, the Millers gathered around the dining table. The atmosphere seemed warm and cheerful, and Alex kept talking about the new friends he had made at school. David and Sarah exchanged satisfied smiles, hoping that this would be a good start to their new family life. However, as the night fell and everything became quiet, Sarah began to feel a little uneasy. She felt a strange coldness in the house, even though they had turned on the heater. The soft squeaking of the wooden floor in the dead of night made her feel that something was wrong. A few days later, strange phenomena began to occur. Alex told his parents that he often heard someone whispering his name when he was playing alone in his room. At first, David and Sarah thought it was just their son's imagination, but Alex insisted that he heard it very clearly. Sarah also began to notice that objects in the house seemed to be strangely disturbed. She clearly remembered leaving her comb on the dressing table, but later found it on the floor. David would occasionally hear strange noises coming from upstairs while he was working in the living room at night. Noises like light footsteps or the sound of objects being dragged. One evening, while Sarah was alone in the kitchen preparing dinner, she suddenly felt someone lightly tap her shoulder. She turned around in surprise, but no one was there. The cold feeling she had felt the first night came back, stronger than ever. She felt as if there was an invisible presence right behind her. Watching her every move, Sarah hurriedly finished dinner and ran into the living room, where David and Alex were watching TV. She told them what she had just experienced, her voice trembling and filled with fear. David hugged his wife, trying to reassure her, but he was also starting to feel uneasy. Perhaps this house was not as simple as it appeared. That night, after Sarah recounted her terrifying experience in the kitchen, the atmosphere in the house became more tense and heavy than ever. The entire Miller family felt uneasy. They tried to reassure each other, but everyone's eyes were filled with worry. When David went to bed, he checked all the doors and windows carefully, making sure everything was locked. However, in the quiet of the night, they were still awakened by strange noises. First, there was the sound of light footsteps on the wooden floor upstairs, even though no one was there. Then, the light in their bedroom suddenly flickered continuously, then went out for a few seconds before coming back on. "Did you see that, David?" Sarah whispered, her voice filled with fear. "I told you, something's wrong here," David hugged his wife tightly, trying to keep his voice calm. It's probably just a power outage. Don't worry too much. But he wasn't sure about that himself. The next morning, Alex told his parents something that made them shiver. He said that while he was playing alone in his bedroom, he saw a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room. The figure was tall and dark, without a face, just standing there silently looking at him. Alex was so scared, he screamed and ran out of the room. "I'm not lying. Mom and Dad, I really saw it," Alex insisted, his eyes still shining with fear. David and Sarah looked at each other. They began to feel really worried. These things couldn't be just imagination anymore. David, a rationalist and always looking for scientific explanations, tried to find the cause of these strange phenomena. He checked the electrical system in the house, carefully examined the cracks in the doors and windows to see if there were any drafts. He even went up to the attic to check if there were any animals hiding there. However, all his efforts were in vain. He found no signs of electrical problems, no cracks for drafts, and the attic was completely empty. His inability to find a reasonable explanation made David feel more uneasy than ever. Sarah, feeling that what was happening seemed to be related to the history of the house, began to research information about the neighborhood and the previous owners. She asked the neighbors around, but most of them didn't know much about house number 14. Finally, she found an old article on the internet about a tragic accident that happened in this house in the 1950s. A family lived here, and a young mother died suddenly and mysteriously in the bedroom upstairs. Sarah felt a cold chill run down her spine when she read this information. She began to suspect that the phenomena her family was experiencing might be related to the spirit of that unfortunate woman. That night, while the whole family was sleeping soundly, a loud noise came from downstairs, waking them up. It was a bang, as if something very heavy had fallen to the floor. David and Sarah quickly jumped up, their hearts pounding in their chests. Alex also woke up, the boy clutching his teddy bear tightly, his eyes wide with fear. Together they went downstairs, carefully taking each step in the dark. When they reached the living room, they were horrified to see that the crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling had fallen to the floor, shattering into pieces. There was no one there, and the doors and windows were locked. The three of them stood there, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. They knew that this was no coincidence. This house was haunted. What do we do?" Sarah whispered, her voice cracking with fear. David hugged his wife and children tightly, his face pale. "I don't know. I really don't know." Alex, trembling, nestled into his parents' arms. "I'm scared. I want to go home." After a moment of heavy silence, David took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "We can't just stand here in fear," he said, his voice shaking but still firm. "We need to find out what's going on, and why that spirit is haunting this house." Sarah nodded in agreement. "I think you're right. Maybe if we know something about the woman who died, we can help her spirit rest in peace." Together they decided to find out more about the history of the house and the woman who died. They began searching the house, rummaging through old drawers, dusty boxes in the attic. Finally, in an old box in the basement, Alex found a yellowed photo. In the photo was a young woman, her face sad but still gentle, holding a rag doll. On the back of the photo was a faded handwritten note. Elizabeth. Spring 1955. Along with the photo, they also found an old letter, in shaky handwriting, telling of the sadness and loneliness of a young mother, who had lost her young daughter to a serious illness. The letter ended with a desperate note about how she didn't want to leave this house, where memories of her beloved daughter still lingered. As Sarah read the letter, she couldn't help but cry. She felt a deep sadness and sympathy for the woman named Elizabeth. I think her spirit is still here, because she's so sad and lonely," Sarah said, her voice breaking. David hugged his wife, feeling a strange sense of empathy as well. "Maybe we should try talking to her," he suggested. "Maybe she just wants us to know how much she hurts." They decided to try a simple Ouija board, hoping to communicate with Elizabeth's spirit and help her find peace. Vào dem du. Gia din Miller tap trung light trong phong kak. Noi chiek den chum da bai vo. Ho dat buck an kua Elizabeth len ban. Zung quan le nung non nen lung len. David ni nong goi. Elizabeth. Noi ko dang o day. Shin hei cho chung toi biet. Chung toi muon ju ko. Ka kan fong I am lang den naget tho. Kai ko tieng geo rit khe ki ben y kua so. Bong nien. Non nen tren ban lay dong du doi. Va mo luong geo lan leo thoi qua kan fong. Kien ka ba noi du cam thay dung tak gay. Mo jiong ti tham u ot vang len trong kong jion tin mish. Jiong noi de noi buon va suko don. Con gai toi. Con bup bi kua con bay. Alex om chad lay con gao bong kua men. Doi mak kao bay mo to nin quan fong. Sarah ni nong noi. Chung thoi da tim thay buck an kua ko va con gai ko. Ko muon chung thoi ju ko tim lai con bup bi du kong. Mo tieng nak nen in gao vang len. Va non nen tren ban tat han. Nung trong bong toi. Gia din Miller cam nyan duok mo su thay doi. Mo su ni num ki la. Nu the noi buon ba bao trum can na bay lao ne da voi di fan now. Sang hom sao. Ki ho kiem tra lai tang ham. Ho tim thay mo con bup bi vai ku ki nam trong mo chiek hop no. Jiong het con bup bi trong buck an kua Elizabeth. Ho dat con bup bi o mo vi tried trong phong kak. Ben gun buck an. Tu du tro di. Nung heen tuong ki la trong can na so 14 fa sycamore da hon ton bien mat. Gia din Miller teep tuk song o du. Va ho tin rang lin hun kua Elizabeth kuoi kung da tim duok su bin yen. That night, the Miller family gathered in the living room, where the chandelier had been broken. They placed Elizabeth's photo on the table, surrounded by flickering candles. David called softly, "Elizabeth, if you're here, please let us know. We want to help you." The room was suffocatingly silent, with only the sound of the wind whistling outside the window. Suddenly, the candle on the table shook violently, and a cold wind blew through the room, making all three of them feel their hair stand on end. A faint whisper rang out in the quiet space, a voice filled with sadness and loneliness. "My daughter, her doll." Alex hugged his teddy bear tightly, his eyes wide open as he looked around the room. Sarah said softly, "We found the photo of you and your daughter. Do you want us to help you find the doll?" A sob rang out, and the candle on the table went out. But in the darkness, the Millers sensed a change. A strange relief, as if the sadness that had long pervaded the house had been lifted. The next morning, when they checked the basement, they found an old rag doll in a small box, exactly like the doll in Elizabeth's photo. They placed the doll in a place of honor in the living room, next to the photo. From then on, the strange phenomena at 14 Sycamore Street completely disappeared. The Millers continued to live there, and they believed that Elizabeth's spirit had finally found peace. True Ghost Story 3. Singing in the Quiet Night. In the fall of 2012, the Johnson family moved to the small town of Port Angeles, Washington, near the edge of Olympic National Park. Tom Johnson, a forestry engineer, had been transferred to the area for work. His wife, Lisa, a freelance graphic designer, was initially nervous about leaving the hustle and bustle of Seattle, but she was quickly drawn to the peaceful beauty and fresh air of the countryside. Their teenage daughter, Megan, 16, was reluctant to move away from her friends and familiar surroundings. The house they rented was at the end of a quiet street. An old-fashioned two-story wooden house with a large porch and a small garden in the back. As the moving truck pulled up in front of the house, Megan sighed, looking at the house with a not-so-enthusiastic expression. The inside of the house felt cozy but also a little old. The wooden floors felt underfoot, and the walls seemed to be soaked in the scent of time. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly homeowner, had left behind a few pieces of old furniture, giving the house a nostalgic feel. "This will be a nice fresh start for all of us," Tom said, trying to keep the mood positive as they began unpacking. Lisa smiled wryly, feeling a slight chill run down her spine. Even though it wasn't too cold outside, Megan quietly carried her boxes upstairs to her room, which had a window overlooking the backyard. In the first few days in the new house, things went pretty normally. Tom started his new job, Lisa set up her home office, and Megan tried to get used to her new school. However, in the evenings, when the house was quiet, Lisa began to hear strange sounds. It was a very soft singing, like a little girl singing a lullaby, coming from somewhere in the house. At first, she thought it might be the wind or the sound of the neighbors. But the singing kept repeating, and it always had a sad melody. One evening, while Lisa was working alone in the living room, the singing came again, this time clearer and closer. She stopped and listened carefully. The singing seemed to be coming from upstairs, and she could make out a few words from the song, though not clearly. It was a very old lullaby, with a sad and mournful melody. Lisa felt a strange unease, and she quickly called Tom. When Tom asked, the singing suddenly stopped. They checked all over the upstairs but found no one. A few days later, Megan began telling her parents that she had heard the singing too. The little girl said that she often heard singing when she was alone in her room, especially late at night. Megan also said that sometimes she felt like someone was watching her, even when no one was there. "I feel like someone is in my room," Megan said, her face full of worry. Tom and Lisa looked at each other, and they began to realize that this was not as simple as they thought. Perhaps this house was more than just old. That night, after Megan told them about feeling like she was being watched in her room, The Johnson family did not sleep well. Every little noise in the house startled them. Around midnight, Lisa woke up, hearing a familiar lullaby coming from somewhere in the house. This time, the singing was clearer, and she could feel the deep sadness in each note. She gently shook Tom awake. "Can you hear that, Tom?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Tom rubbed his eyes, listened for a moment, then nodded slightly, his expression becoming serious. "I heard it. It's a child singing." They both listened in silence, the singing repeating over and over, carrying an indescribable melancholy. A few days later, Lisa began to notice small, childish objects appearing strangely in the house. One morning, she found a small, old porcelain doll lying on the living room floor, even though she was sure they didn't have any such toys. A few days later, while cleaning the kitchen, she found a crayon drawing on the table. A drawing of a little girl with long hair and sad eyes. These objects didn't belong to their family, and they appeared randomly, creating a strange and unsettling atmosphere in the house. Megan had the most direct experience. One evening, while looking in the mirror in her bedroom, she caught a glimpse of a girl standing behind her. She turned around, startled, but no one was there. The image lasted only a brief moment, but Megan caught a glimpse of the girl's long black hair and sad eyes. Another time, while alone in her room, Megan felt an unusually cold aura around her, and she smelled a faint scent of jasmine, a scent she had never smelled before. David, despite his efforts to find reasonable explanations, began to feel uneasy about the strange happenings in the house. He decided to research the history of the house. He went to the local library and looked up information about the previous owners. He found records showing that the house had been built in the early 20th century, and that several families had lived there. Among them, he noticed a family named Miller, coincidentally their family name, who lived here in the 1950s. Records recorded that they had a daughter named Lily, who died of a serious illness at the age of 8. David felt a strange coincidence and a bad premonition. One evening, while the family was watching television in the living room, they suddenly heard a very loud noise coming from upstairs, like someone running or dragging something. They stood up together, their hearts pounding, and cautiously went up the stairs. When they reached the upstairs hallway, they saw a scene that made them terrified. Megan's bedroom door was wide open, even though she had carefully closed it. And on Megan's desk, with the small stones she often used to decorate, there was a neatly arranged line, "I want to play." The invitation was simple, but it carried a fear that made their hearts stop. Megan hugged her mother's hand tightly, her eyes wide with fear. "Mommy, I don't want to play." Lisa hugged her daughter, trying to calm her down, but she was shaking too. David sighed, his face full of worry and helplessness. "We have to do something," he said, his voice low. "We can't keep living in fear like this." In the following days, Megan began to feel a strange connection with the spirit of little Lily. She often heard the sad lullaby more clearly, sometimes even heard a whisper calling her name. In her dreams, Megan dreamed of a little girl with long black hair and sad eyes holding an old rag doll. The little girl always looked at Megan with pleading eyes. Megan felt a vague sadness and a strange urge to learn more about Lily. She began searching the house, hoping to find something that belonged to her. The strange phenomena in the house became more frequent and more obvious. The furniture in Megan's room occasionally moved by itself. The doors opened and closed by themselves. And a sad lullaby echoed throughout the house. Especially at night, the temperature in Megan's room often dropped abnormally, creating a feeling of bone-chilling cold. One evening, while the family was having dinner, the chandelier on the dining table suddenly shook violently and fell, shattering into many pieces, causing everyone to panic. Based on what they had learned about Lily, the Johnson family decided to try a different approach. They bought a new rag doll and placed it in Megan's room, hoping that Lily would like it. They also spoke to Lily often, calling her name softly and telling her that they wanted to help her find peace. One evening, when Megan was alone in her room, she saw the new rag doll on her bed suddenly move. It slowly tilted its head, as if looking at Megan. Megan no longer felt fear, but instead a sense of sadness and sympathy. "Hello, Lily," she whispered. "I'm Megan. I want to be your friend." On their last night at 14 Sycamore, the Johnsons went into Megan's room together. They placed the old rag doll they found next to the new one. Lisa softly sang a sad lullaby that they had heard Lily sing before. When the song ended, a gentle breeze blew through the room, and they felt a warm and peaceful presence envelop them. Megan saw a blurry figure of a little girl standing in the corner of the room, smiling softly and holding an old rag doll tightly in her arms. Then, the figure slowly faded into thin air. From that night on, the Johnson family never heard the singing or saw any strange phenomena again. They knew that Lily had finally found peace and had left the house. Although they had moved away, the Johnson family would never forget the terrifying and touching experience at 14 Sycamore Street, where they met and helped the spirit of little Lily. Thank you for listening to today's story. If you want to challenge your nerves further, subscribe to the channel to continue discovering other horror mysteries.